Hello, and welcome to this episode of The Brood. Tonight we're going to be talking about werewolves. We've selected a few werewolf pictures to discuss. We'll be talking about Company of Wolves, a Neil Jordan film from the mid-'80s. We'll be talking about the classic Hammer movie, Curse of the Werewolf, and then the Neil Marshall's Dog Soldiers, three very different werewolf movies. First of all, I'm Josh. Welcome. And you guys want to introduce yourselves? Say hi.
Yes. My name is Chris, and happy to be here.
And I'm Letitia. I'm also happy to be here.
Not as happy as I am. I'm going to challenge you.
I don't know, man. We'll see.
All right. So before we kind of get into the movies, I just wanted to see if we could kind of lay out some things that we noticed and some things that might get us started here. One of the things is that I noticed as I started delving into these movies and others, kind of boning up for my werewolf marathon, is just how small the pool is. I mean, unlike vampire movies or zombie movies or something, there's just not as much, and It seems to me that's kind of obvious, like a financial restriction. Doing a werewolf movie is obviously a lot harder than a vampire movie or something. Mm-hmm. Slap some white paint on somebody and you got a vampire. But what makes that interesting to me, I think, is that it means that the mythology is still pretty open-ended. I mean, just in the movies that we're going to discuss tonight, the werewolf myth is just really different from movie to movie. The way that we're expected to understand what werewolves mean or how the curse works, etc., is really up in the air. It seems like everybody's kind of recreating it from whole cloth every time. So it's kind of exciting that it's something fertile to play with that hasn't been totally played out, I think.
Yeah, that's something that I noticed, like when I watched the films, that at certain points, especially with Curse of the Werewolf, that I kind of bucked, and was like a little uneasy about the mythology that was in that film. But then I had to stop and say, well, what am I comparing that to? Because I do have some sense of, oh, well, this is how, werewolf mythology works in a film. But when I really sat there, I'm like, I guess really my only basis is, the Wolfman and kind of things that reference that. Mm-hmm. It's interesting that pretty much the mythology is based basically largely on one film.
And Letitia, you before we started in on this little marathon, you kind of admitted to us that you hadn't really seen many werewolf movies, right?
Yeah, I hadn't. I had to really bone up on my werewolves. I watched Wolfman, the original one, and I watched American Werewolf in London, and so that was quite an education. I really did not know much about werewolves, so yeah. And it was interesting to me too how much it could be played with, because I did have that, even though I don't know much about werewolves, I did have that basic sort of narrative idea of how that works and even what it's about, which I'm sure we'll talk about later. But it was interesting to see how that can be changed and morph into something different and doesn't remain a sort of monolithic idea throughout. I like that.
Well, I think that I think the reason there's a lot of ambiguity I was realizing with werewolf mythology and werewolf ideas is because the werewolf doesn't contain the same dichotomy as, say Frankenstein or Dracula, which is death and undeath, or a vampire, or this other creature that Frankenstein is. It's a completely living being in both senses, in both its states, and any way you want to divide it. And I think that makes it ambiguous. Life creates this ambiguity in some way, maybe.
Oh, that's good, because, one thing is that it's also about the body and about life in a very vital way, and that is always changing, always sort of complex.
Yeah. I think that this is good to follow our body horror episode, actually.
Oh, yeah.
The more I watch the werewolf movies, I was thinking of body horror with all the films in a way.
Yeah, and of course, what's interesting, I don't know, or what I kept picking up on is that, because I was thinking the same thing in terms of body horror, is that the way, in multiple cases, even in the films that we're going to talk about tonight, that the horror part is kind of stripped away from that there's something almost positive in some of these transformations. But
oh, absolutely.
Because we don't see a painful one really until American Werewolf in London in the 80s, right. In the time of body horror. Before that, it is always a kind of positive or at least magical series of dissolves. You know what I mean? Like, so it's very, there's not a real violence to any of the transformations, I think. Well, no, Company of Wolves, but I mean that's the 80s too. But
yeah, I guess that there's more a sense of rather than say a transformation like in Cronenberg's The Fly or something, that this is more of a freeing transformation, however terrifying it may be, that this is a release in some way.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, they all do have that in common, though. The idea that becoming the wolf it's invigorating. You're more alive once this happens. I think that happens in almost all of them. That's one common thing.
Yeah, I like that. It, kind of playing off of Chris's dichotomy and what you just said there, that unlike the life-death issue, that the werewolf becomes more like life and more life. That being extra alive, extra awake to things, which is something that a lot of the movies play with, in terms of the heightened senses and kind of, really just kind of the vigor that comes with it before, everything goes wrong.
Yeah. I mean, I guess we see that, and then that leads us to the Company of Wolves, because I feel like there's a lot of ambiguity in that film of, is this wolf and becoming a wolf and this state of, transforming into a wolf, is it really that bad?
Oh, yeah.
Is it really, I don't think in the end, in the end it's not seen as something that's, there is a freedom that we are shown in the, jumping through the window and running free, All
right, so why don't we use that as a nice segue here into talking about some of the movies. Letitia, do you want to maybe give us a quick intro to Company of Wolves, which was your selection for this week?
Yeah, definitely. So this film was directed by Neil Jordan, fill me in, what else has he done? I know his name, but what are
the Crime Game.
Okay, great, yeah. And so even with that one, right, the sort of, there's this issue of sexuality and ambiguity in play at a point in that film. But so this film, it takes place in the 80s. Something I had to revisit that I didn't realize. It takes place in the 80s. I kind of missed it the first time I watched it. It starts with a family and two sisters. And the story basically takes place, though, with the younger sister dreaming. We almost, within the first 5 or 10 minutes, go into a dream world. That seems to play with a lot of themes that come up, particularly with the Little Red Riding Hood story. It kind of plays with these ideas about warnings about male sexuality. We get different stories told by the grandmother figure. And I don't know if I want to go into any of them in particular yet. Maybe we can talk about some of them when we discuss thematically. But it's basically this young girl is imagining her sister has been killed by wolves in the woods, and that's left a little bit open-ended of what exactly that means or what these wolves are. And we get various stories that kind of play with issues of sexuality and community and evil and good. And by the end, though, by the end of the dream sequence, we get this meeting at the grandmother's house, much like the Little Red Riding Hood story, but it's very different than the traditional story. It kind of ends with this, instead of killing the wolf, the werewolf, there's this sort of joining. And then the movie ends with the girl waking up and the wolf coming through a window. So it's very ambiguous, it's very dreamlike, and it feels more like a playing with themes and stories than really a strong narrative pull through. I don't know if you guys want me to say more about the specifics until we talk about themes, but that was kind of my feeling about it. Angela Lansbury is the grandmother. She's great.
Yeah.
She's very
thought
funny.
the film really. I had had seen the cover of this, the poster for this film for years, and I always thought it was really, it freaked me out when I was a kid. So I never saw it, but I have to say I really, really loved it. I felt like it fell somewhere, but it's like it completes a triangle with Labyrinth and Suspiria. I feel like it's like kind of the in that same world. And I think there's a lot of parallels with the film Labyrinth, which as I was watching it, I was like, wow, this kind of dream world that, our, protagonist is going into, and then comes back. And in a sense, just like Alice in Wonderland, something, and like Labyrinth, something comes back with her, but it's like something she can't stop. It's not, when the wolf comes through at the end, which I don't think is just a shock tactic. I think it's a statement, and I don't know, I really, really enjoyed it. And I guess the thing I really was interested in, two things, I guess they're similar though, was the way that the idea of something foreign or someone foreign was addressed literally and metaphorically. Because in a couple of the stories that the grandmother tells, or at least one of them I know, a woman marries a foreigner, and this foreigner turns out to be a werewolf. And in the last story, this man who has an accent, who is a foreigner of some sort, turns out to be a werewolf. And I think that, is, there are obviously these cautionary tales, but there's something interesting about that idea. I don't know if you picked up on, if anybody else was focusing on that.
Yeah, that was a big theme to me, and also that the grandmother's warnings in this particular world, they seem very much about fear of the other, fear of for the foreign, fear of male sexuality, of female sexuality. Like in this, the warnings seem to be. It's not that we shouldn't care about them or that they aren't, but they're being shown for what they are, which is very fearful. And that once you actually are in some kind of communication or relationship with that thing that is fearful or other, it seems to be different than what she had said. So the grandmother figure was really interesting to me, and how she told these stories and what she chose to sort of demonize or other and not.
Yeah, and I guess, go ahead, Josh.
I was just say, I think that's really what the whole film is about. We've talked together here about in the past about the kind of conservative nature of a lot of horror, and just kind of I don't know, the normalizing force of a lot of the stories that appear in horror films. The kind of return in the end to a right world, and I felt like that. No matter how different the movies we watched, they all contained that same germ in them, which was the "don't stray from the path," kind of idea, which seems to be really representative here. That it's like that's what we're about. Just what Letitia's describing there is the kind of the straight and narrow, the known, the well worn, and this. Instilling fear and straying from that in any way. You gave a nice kind of catalog there of the ways that we might stray from that. And yeah, that's what I love about this movie, is that it really does call into question that those warnings, it kind of deconstructs them for us, I think.
Yeah, that definitely, the Company of Wolves, and I think that's really, it does deconstruct them, and it does call them into question, and it does foreground something else that I had mentioned to you, was this idea of the fear of like hybridity, these hybrid natures, or like this mixing of natures of things, that as long as something is identifiable as one thing, it's all right, or identifiable as another thing, but once they're combined, it becomes dangerous or something to be afraid of. And I think there's a line explicitly in the Company of Wolves where he says, not quite man, not beast.
Mm.
Than the last story, and I thought that was really, really interesting. That was something I picked up on that film that I liked a lot, and that I see throughout some of the other films as well.
It's also wonderfully complicated because there is kind of that split, and we could get very Freudian about it, and but there's also this idea that the grandmother's warning, the wonderfully kind of evocative phrase that she uses, which is that that some wolves and some men are furry on the inside, and
Good one.
that it's not about one or the other, but as you said, the hybrid, that really that some men are both things, that they're men and they're and that they're wolves is frightening and true. I guess that that there's in a lot of these movies there's a lot of that kind of Jekyll Hyde kind of story buried in there as well too, that what's coming out isn't really wolf at all, but is just some other part of our nature, that this kind of wild bestial part of us that's that you don't have to have any special curse to have, that it's just called being human. It's that id.
And in Company of Wolves, we're given both kind of it's pure sides of this coin, which is we have a dog at the beginning of the Company of Wolves that there's a brief interaction with, and then we have human male figures in the fantasy realms, like the father, David Warner, and those are both kind of pure and acceptable incarnations of either animal or man, and so we're given those ends of the spectrum. But then these interrupters and these hybrids come, and that's where all this ambiguity and all this danger is introduced. And actually, to jump ahead a little bit, in Dog Soldiers we also see that there's a dog, a pure, lovable, reliable dog, and also a very reliable human protagonist. And anything that falls in the middle is what is dangerous.
That's true, but in Company of Wolves, even the sort of regular, real human person is complicated in terms of whether or not they have this wolfish nature. I think there's a quote from the mother. Oh, it's when the daughter is sort of hearing her parents have sex, right? You remember this part?
Yeah.
And she asks the next day, does he hurt you or is this hurt? And the mother says, you pay too much attention to your grandmother. If there's a beast in men, let me see if I can find that. I think I wrote it down. Oh yeah, if there's a beast in men, it meets its match in women too. So the idea is that this hybridity, this sense of things that are ambiguous, it's more about perception than reality. It's all ambiguous. There's beasts and humans, and so to me, the Company of Wolves was about that willingness to see that there isn't such purity or lack of purity, that this idea of hybridization is not really, it's not quite so simple.
Yeah.
I'll throw a challenge out for you guys, because I've been trying to think about something else that I think this movie, because this movie is obviously about all of those things, and it's also about werewolf movies. It's also about it's by far the most kind of meta of anything that we're looking at. And one of the things that one of the reasons that you might watch a werewolf movie is for the transformation scene, right? Which is kind of generally the big scene in any of these movies. This movie has 5 or 6 of them, and every single one of them is completely different. We have a very mechanical kind of almost robotic kind of wolf thing. We have this very naturalistic one with the hair growing and it kind of bursting through him. We have a very dreamlike one. Sometimes we have really kind of seamless, where one moment they're a human and the next moment they're a wolf. It seemed like the film was trying to say or do something with that. This kind of I mean, obviously it's made up of many vignettes, so obviously there's lots of stories going on anyway, but just the inconsistency within the one movie kind of struck me.
Yeah, no, I did actually notice, now that you bring that up, absolutely, but I didn't notice it when I was watching the film, but you're absolutely right. It kind of contains every up to that point, every possible way that transformation could happen. Maybe that's another dimension of maybe what Letitia was getting at, of, I don't know, taking taking away that scariness or that need to fear these things, these hybrid things, these transformations, by seeing it in so many different ways, getting all these multiple perspectives on it. Maybe it's fleshing it out in some way. I don't know.
It's always interesting to think of the perspective from which the story is being told. Like, sometimes the grandmother tells stories, and I think once or twice the daughter tells stories. From the grandmother's perspective, things are fearful, they're frightening, they're other. From the girl's perspective, and I'm trying to remember which ones, I know that the one that sticks out for me, the transformation, is the husband, the foreigner husband who a woman marries, and their wedding night he leaves. Do you remember that one? And then he comes back. And I loved that transformation. It was crazy, the animal comes through his mouth, and there's blood, and there's then this,
But that's painful and violent.
Yes, that one was extremely violent and was extremely fearful. That was from the grandmother's perspective. Mm-hmm. And that whole story was interesting. I loved that vignette because it had the husband coming back and beheading the thing and then slapping the wife, and there was all this interesting sort of sexual politics and power things happening. But in terms of transformations, I can't quite. I think that what's the story that the girl tells, and what's that transformation?
Well, she tells a story of the werewolf woman?
Yes. Right, the one who's wounded, and the priest takes her in, and I don't remember any actual visual transformation in that one.
Yeah, and I guess the most important thing to me is actually how the last transformation takes place with when she arrives at her grandmother's house, and he's there and he becomes a wolf. It's interesting because he's allowed to linger in between the state of wolf and man for, it seems like, quite a while, and interact with her, and to be recognizable as, a man, more of a anthropomorphic creature than, in other transformations, and a kind of handsome, attractive, with those eyes and, shirtless. He's still a sexualized creature for a while, humanoid, creature.
Oh, yeah, more so after he's hybridized, I guess.
Yeah, actually. Yeah. So I think that, and that happens in the last, but I don't remember whose perspective that is.
So I like what we're describing here as this movie is kind of the Rashomon of werewolf films.
Yeah, yeah.
Which I think it kind of is. I mean, I think that really it's like we kind of get the same story told over and over again. We get variations on a theme, and perspective does make a lot of difference. But I love that last one that you guys were just discussing, that just that there's something just really empowering and beautiful about that scene, in the way that I think Letitia said that he's more attractive in that moment. And so much so that the woman transforms along with him, right? And I just that there's just this kind of freeing kind of throwing off of those fears, and kind of embracing that that this wilderness, this wild part of our nature is can be really kind of wonderful and freeing. I
think it's interesting. Yeah, I think it's interesting too, because that their brief relationship takes a lot of negotiating, and in a sense is the most real and complex of any relationship you see in that film, because it takes, there is so much ambiguity in that scene, and so much uncertainty of emotionally, or like who's feeling what. And I think that is really the scene that takes that film to just a total the next level. You know.
Yeah, it's a beautiful scene. But one thing I noticed is when when the grandmother, he hits her, and did you notice that she was maybe made of porcelain or something?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah,
she's not made of flesh. She's like this sort of brittle thing that explodes against the floor, you know. And to me, that was the moment I was like, yes, well, you know, just break that apart, because that's sort of a particular point of view that is afraid of the flesh, is afraid of the things that this figure represents, you know. So.
Yeah, constantly returning to that dream imagery, but I guess that what I see right there, and even in that moment that you're referring to, is just this refusal of victimization. You know, this kind of turning the whole thing on its head. That you know, he tells her to throw her clothes into the fire because she won't need them, and she's just like, "All right."
yeah.
Like, you know, she's good to go, and it's quite a strong scene.
And I think it's interesting that we get so many. Something I found really striking in this film is all the shots of just the endless forest, like approaching the mountains with the moon over it. You get these landscape shots that when you're looking out, it's the most dark, you know, fearsome landscape that anything could be out there. It's scary. It's this scary, you know, kind of dark forest of the mind. But in the end, that's where they run to. They break out and they run to this place that we've been shown time and time again, kind of as this is the frightening place that is just beyond your door. If you go too far, you're going to be in these woods and you're going to be lost, and it's dark and it's scary. And in the end, you know, it's about running to that place instead of away from it. And I just think that it's done really well in that film.
Yeah.
Well, would this be a good time to kind of segue into a Curse of the Werewolf, which I think that we would have to try pretty hard to come up with something kind of more different. In terms of its style, in terms of its storytelling, in terms of its approach. So, Chris, do you want to maybe just kind of give us the primer on Curse of the Werewolf?
Yeah, and I think it's interesting, since we're following up the Company of Wolves with this. I mean, to look at this is probably, you know, exactly what Company of Wolves is referencing and you know, kind of turning on its head and working, you know, to you know, subvert this whole idea. But the Curse of the Werewolf is a Hammer film. It's Terence Fisher, I believe, 1961, and it takes place in Spain around in the 18th century. And the most interesting part of the film for me is how it begins, because it creates its own kind of werewolf mythology, the genesis of how this kind of this curse came about, and the way that it creates this curse is through the story of this beggar that comes to a marquis's house on his wedding night and looking for charity, but instead is humiliated and forced to act like an animal for the amusement of the marquis and his guests. And through some circumstances, this beggar gets thrown into the dungeon and is kept there for however many years and fed scraps and eats meat off of bones and essentially becomes an animal. There's a blind dungeon keeper's daughter who is taking care of this beggar and feeding him. At a certain point, she's raped by the beggar, and she becomes pregnant. The beggar dies, and the blind woman runs away and has her child, and the child is taken into custody by a kind nobleman and raised, but with the knowledge that something is not right about this child, because he was born out of wedlock. He was born on Christmas Day, which is a bad omen, and early in his life he shows these wolfish tendencies, and they have some idea that something bad is going to happen. And anyway, the boy grows up, becomes Oliver Reed, Oliver Reed sets out, Oliver Reed sets out to, get a job, move away from the man who raised him. And, they think everything's going to be okay, but certain circumstances occur and the beast starts to come out once again. And I mean, from there, I don't want to spoil anything, but it's I think it's interesting because it shows how this creature came to be. And our protagonist, if you will, Oliver Reed, this boy that grows up to be the werewolf is cursed, like we see so often, like this person is just cursed with, being a werewolf. But we also get to see how, how that came to be. And I think that's interesting to see man's part in creating that. And that's kind of why I chose this film.
It is fascinating and kind of baffling when I was watching it. I'd never seen this movie before. Mm-hmm. And, I'm thinking The Wolf Man and, Werewolf of London and all these where, there's at least a kind of film vocabulary for how these things work, and it was just kind of completely jettisoned here in a pretty surprising way. I guess my thoughts and my interest in this really are kind of right in line with yours, Chris, in that what seems to me, this movie seems strangely even more allegorical than Company of Wolves in a more straight-ahead kind of way. That there's something about that curse being almost there doesn't seem to be much supernatural about it,
No, yeah, exactly.
And so it seems like it's an allegory for something, and I think it could be for a lot of things, but I'm not sure what is an allegory for. It's kind of my leading question for this.
I guess I took a lot from it that because in a lot of other werewolf films, it's completely supernatural, and I think in the supernatural nature of this werewolf curse, it's something that's attributed to something mythological that's beyond our knowing, that is something that we carry with us, but we can't have any real knowledge of, not a direct confrontation with. It's something that is on our dark side, that's hidden, that is there and will come out in this curse, but we can't have access to. But in this film, I think it's interesting that through a person's cruelty, a person's choice to be an animal, to act like an animal, and to denigrate or like to force someone else to be their idea of what an animal is, they infect them and they cause the curse through this conscious decision to be cruel. And I think that's interesting. It calls into question, what is this animal part that we're so afraid of? Is it, because I think the idea a lot of times is that, the part that we're referring to with this werewolf curse all the time is this animal lust and this animal, cruelty and the inside of us that comes out in this very romantic kind of way, or we literally turn into a beast or whatever. But the most kind of despicable form of like animal, behavior is the initial spark that, that creates this curse. I think that's interesting.
Yeah. The thing that was interesting to me was that this, in the other movies, it's mostly sort of this, it's a natural thing, as you guys said. It's more from nature, from the woods, from our animal nature, right? But in this, there's not this sort of civilization and not civilization split. It's civilization creates the monster. And it seemed almost to me like a metaphor for or an allegory for sort of criminal behavior, to somehow explain how we create monsters through, mistreatment, through things like rape and horrific treatment of people. It creates this sort of monster that is almost that isn't related to animal nature, but is a completely civilization related thing. That there wouldn't be something like this if people didn't do it, which is fascinating.
Yeah, and then on top of that, then they keep him in prison for how many years? So I think it is pretty. You might be right. It might be very directly connected to something we could see to do with like the criminal.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think it has a lot to do with class. I mean,
Oh God, yes.
that the Marquis is the most evil character in the movie.
I mean,
well
it's pretty
beyond
preposterous. I mean,
Yeah.
it's interesting. I think that first scene has so much ambiguity in certain senses because this idea of animal nature kind of goes back and forth from the Marquis to we see a sudden shift when the beggar becomes intoxicated and he does his jig and he grabs the food off the floor and starts to play into the role of the dog. At the end of the scene, he makes that vulgar comment that gets him thrown into the dungeon. It seems like there are, there's not a real clear-cut guilty and innocent dynamic. I mean, it definitely, goes one way more than the other in that scene, but I think it's a very interesting negotiation between, someone assigning someone a role, someone accepting that role and becoming that role, and this kind of agreement that's going on. I don't know. I just think the first scene I think is the best scene in the film, or that whole moment is just so interesting.
There's also something. I mean, obviously, if we wanted to talk about what this curse is, which is very much open for discussion, I think the idea that for all of that cruelty and that whole little dynamic there in the opening scene, the idea that should be carried over into the next generation is kind of interesting.
Yeah.
But just how I was thinking about it this afternoon and thinking about that one of the things about this kind of curse of lycanthropy being so masculine, that in most cases that, and I guess I kind of identify with this idea a little bit that there is this kind of version of masculinity out there that is this kind of brutish, violent, mindless creature that even those of us who do our best to to keep it at bay, that there's a sense that that there's always that kind of version of masculinity kind of hiding somewhere underneath the not too far down. There's a 12-year-old kid hidden in all of us, and this movie seems to really kind of play on that. I mean, that's really what the curse is men behaving badly.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's that, something that is that addressing of, it is very masculine, but at the same time, I think just that aggressive thing that humanity needed to claw its way to, wherever we are evolutionarily, but that now is, no longer necessary in the same way. And where does that go? And how much are we willing to give ourselves over to aggressive behavior as a creative force, as something that creates? And I think it's something that we don't. And there's not a place for that as much in our civilization, but we're haunted by that specter, of that thing. And I think that's kind of what a lot of these things are addressing. I guess in this film it's more a manifest kind of thing of like, a male kind of, this masculine aggression and this kind of beast within. But I think, I don't know, I see where you're coming from, trying to flesh it out more.
It was interesting to me, the relationship between sort of sex and the beast part in this movie. I wasn't quite, like, usually that's kind of like those things are associated in a way. But in this one, the Oliver Reed's character is having this sort of relationship with I can't remember what her name is. Anyway, she's sort of the high class daughter.
Yeah.
And but her presence overnight is what keeps him from transforming. And I thought that the key was going to be that this sort of illicit sexual relationship was going to be the thing that made him become the beast, you know?
Yeah.
So sort of the sort of male sexuality, the aggression, I don't really have anything to say except for, you know, what is the relationship between that beast?
I maybe like what can be seen as like this idea of love, something like love, a non-sexual love, is something that can, you know, something that can keep the beast at bay. Because love, this kind of love, non-sexual, is a very civilized kind of idea. You know what I mean? Maybe that has something to do with it, rather than something that is, you know, the opposite of that. Any kind of like, you know, consummated, I don't know, aggressive kind of sexuality is more animal, and so.
Yeah, I guess to me, it seems like the key word in what you're saying, Chris, is civilizing rather than love. I think that women in a lot of these movies, that's the role that they play, whether it's the grandmother or the mother, or in, you know, in this case, the love interest. That's you know that's what they are. They're the civilizers. You know, they're the ones that keep. That keep everything in check, you know, that kind of keep the beast in line, you know.
It's like a Judd Apatow movie, right? It's the same thing. Like the girlfriend or the wife is like, do your work, have a job, you can be civilized. It's the same dynamic.
I think it is. It's. I mean, it's totally this male kind of, you know, as the battleground of like this human struggle of like, you know, man or beast kind of thing. And yes, the woman is definitely on the outside, like as this stabilizing force that's not corrupted by this kind of, you know, struggle. So I could definitely, you know, watching this, I could definitely see it not appealing to, you know, to seem kind of ridiculous to a woman. Like if I was, except not The Company of Wolves though. Because I thought that was like use this idea to kind of empower in a certain way, you know.
A movie that's not on our list, but that we all watch and I think we all love, is American Werewolf in London, and that's another werewolf movie that's kind of referencing werewolf movies from start to finish, and our protagonist in that movie kind of does this little riff on werewolf movies, and he's thinking about, you know, the Wolfman, and basically makes this little statement about how he believes that, you know, a werewolf can only be killed by someone who loves them, you know, and that was one of the first movies I reviewed before doing this, and it's just remarkable how well it holds up as you kind of move through the catalog here, you know, that. There's the civilizing force, but then that's really the destructive force for, you know, I guess that's almost more of a positive spin on this dichotomy between the wild and the civilized, is that that us humans, as messed up as we are and as sick as our civilization may be, that there is love, you know, that this abstract concept that we all talk about as love seems to kind of stand over and against all of this other curse. You know?
Yeah, it's the only thing like kind of like illogical enough to work against this kind of strict, you know, illogical kind of curse, but at the same time, the curse of being a werewolf is in a lot of ways way more logical than love, you know. Maybe that's, I don't know.
I mean, you in an email, Chris, you actually made a comment about, because as we were talking a little bit about this this civilization versus wilderness kind of thing that plays out down to the, you know, stay off the moors, keep to the path kind of thing all the way, and in Dog Soldiers it kind of takes a different turn, but I mean, you made a kind of offhand comment about King Kong, but I mean, I see that same drama play out there, right? I mean, the wild intruding on the civilized, and, you know, it was beauty that killed the beast, right? I mean, that
Yeah,
love is the force that comes in, and
yeah, that's the X factor, not the giant ape that they bring into New York. It's that. Yeah, exactly. And I think that I didn't actually think about that. I was just thinking about this desire, that this kind of like masochistic desire that humans have to bring the wildness, to build something up and then set an animal loose in it. But this destructive desire, but at the same time, yeah, it's not that really causes the mess. Yeah, it's beauty. It's this love that King Kong feels for the woman. So yeah, I think that's interesting. Yeah, I mean, we talked a lot about wilderness versus civilization, and I guess the interesting thing, which I guess we never did, but would to be really define what do we mean by that, by civilization, and by, because we were saying wilderness and wildness kind of interchangeably. Like, what do we mean by that? I think this would be a good time to maybe talk about Dog Soldiers, because I feel like that movie really puts a lot of those things into question and plays with our ideas of like, who is the animal, who's not the animal, especially with using soldiers. I thought was a very interesting, spin on that.
Okay, so let me give the spiel here. So Dog Soldiers is a Neil Marshall film from the early 2000s, I believe. Yeah. And Neil Marshall is also responsible for the equally flawed but equally wonderful Descent, which is a great movie. And our protagonist in that is Cooper. He's in the British military. When we're first introduced to him, he's kind of being put to the test, and the test basically comes down to whether he's willing to shoot an innocent dog, and he balks at this and kind of loses out on whatever position he was fighting for there. And then we jump ahead a ways, and we see him later on with a group of other soldiers, and they're in the Scottish Highlands, of course. And everybody knows that's where werewolves are from, right?
Yeah.
And they end up being set upon by a pack of werewolves that corner them in this nice little cottage. It might as well be grandma's house. And the rest of the movie basically plays out as a zombie film, with the soldiers trying to protect themselves inside the house as they're being set upon by hyper-intelligent werewolves. Some of them are becoming infected by bites and changing themselves, and I don't know. I find this movie very satisfying, mostly because, as in The Descent, the human drama kind of works on its own level, and then there's monsters.
Yeah.
That it's there's just a movie going on, and with werewolves, and I don't know. I think that this is actually a perfect segue out of Curse of the Werewolf in our discussion there, because once again, the monsters here are the humans, right? I mean, the most despicable characters are clearly the people, and so I don't know. Is that part of this dichotomy between wilderness and civilization? Is that the werewolves even here, who seem very intelligent and able to do things that they're not able to do in a lot of movies, their motives are attributed to instinct, self-preservation, protecting their home, etc., whereas the human motivations are much darker and much harder to
they're much more complicated in their complexity, kind of. They reveal themselves to be a lot darker, and I think that Dog Soldiers is really interesting. That beginning where the protagonist is asked to shoot a dog. I mean, from I took that as he's asking him to do something, to kill another animal, in a sense to give himself over to what is being painted as an animal like ability to kill remorselessly. But I think a lot of times what was interesting to me is this attempt in these films for humans to define what they say, what is animal, and humans' reconstruction of the idea of what animal behavior is far more cruel than animals are. And so he wants him to kill the dog without remorse, without feeling the way a predator would kill in nature. But there is cruelty in what he wants him to do because it's totally senseless. And I think that kind of sparked the whole thing, where the film goes. And then we see soldiers who we see as, some people might see as the embodiment of this kind of like, ability to kill, this animal ability to kill, and we see them put up against actual animals that are killing the way animals kill, and it only makes them more human, the humans, in the face of that. I don't know, I felt like there was a lot of interesting things going on in that film. But one thing I did write about it is man's attempt to ascribe a cruelty to animals that is actually much more human in the end.
That's like the central thing, right? That we have soldiers who are planning to attack from inside of the home of these werewolf family. So there's like, this whole. It was hard to know where to assign your allegiances. I mean, not so much, but that whole idea that they both basically have the soldiers and the werewolves have the same. They have the same agenda. They want to survive. They want to have their territory safe. So that was interesting to me, what it was doing with soldiers versus werewolves, and how the werewolves were upright, how they made plans. This is very different than what we've seen previously, which is more like just a sort of killing everything kind of thing. This was much more planned cruelty, and the parallels were interesting to me.
I was going to say the other thing is, like you said, another interesting thing we saw was the ability to not become werewolf.
Yeah.
That was very interesting. That adds a whole nother dimension, to it, that in itself is like really interesting, because he said like making plans is one thing, and then the choice to become an animal or become this creature at a certain point. That's what I was thinking about.
Which is no different than the choice between, shooting a dog or not shooting a dog. That by the end, the one bastion of human civilization that in the movie, which is the house. Spoiler alert here coming up, but that it turns out that they're in the wolves' home. By the end of the movie, basically any differences between the human characters and the werewolf characters are essentially erased. I mean, it seems to me that's what this movie is about, that we can move back and forth between these two realms. And it may be pretty frightening, but we're all capable of doing that, and for various motives, right?
It's interesting.
Go ahead.
I was going to say, and to take that as kind of almost this idea that an occupying force comes to realize that they're in someone else's home. I never really thought of that until you kind of said they realize they're in the werewolf's home. That there's these monsters outside. Why are they trying to get in? Oh, because we're in where they live. I think that's kind of interesting.
Yeah. But what did you guys think of I guess I'm always harping on the whole women and horror thing, and I always will. So I just prepare for that. But what was the idea of the feminine presence in the movie? The woman who we find out in the end is a werewolf. Man, another spoiler, I guess.
No.
So what was that? What was the function of that in the movie that you guys think?
I think maybe to kind of play with their preconceptions that they would, I think these soldiers wouldn't assume that she was initially she's their savior, and then also she's a woman. I don't think they're going to see her as any threat at all. It's more of a kind of, I don't know, it just makes it even more shocking to them. it plays with that this assumptions that they have.
It's also yet another play on Red Riding Hood, right? I mean, that we're inverting everything, and that the wolf in Grandma's clothing is a little more corporeal here. That it's just a little gender switch on the Red Riding Hood story, right?
Yeah, and also I guess another playing with those relationships where not only is it that they're not being attacked in their home, it turns out they're in the home of the attacker, and then not only is one of their allies turns out to be essentially one of their enemies. I mean, there's a relationship developing there. There's real feelings shared between the human and this creature. I think it's subverting a lot of ideas that we're just, and I think it's a good film because it does it in a very subtle way. It can be watched as, I mean, it's such an entertaining movie, but there are a lot of those things going on. A lot of those, recontextualizing a lot of these ideas and subverting like that. Like, yeah, you can feel a lot of emotions for the enemy, essentially.
Although I would say that there's also, and this might be a weakness of the film too, is that while that seems so rich and kind of refuses to be black and white, then we're still given kind of very black and white villains in the movie that kind of twist their mustaches and
that guy's pretty ridiculous. I like him though because I feel like in anything that's similar to like a Night of the Living Dead kind of scenario where you're trapped in a house, you have to have one guy that's just a total bastard.
Right? There's always the asshole.
There's always one asshole and a totally unreasonable person. And that's just that might be the most traditional element in the film, is that it can't function without one really obnoxious, terrible character that is just will always say the wrong thing, like Cooper in Night of the Living Dead. But yeah, no, I know what you mean. Like he's a pretty villainous villain, I liked it. I hadn't seen the film in a long time, and I think it's really good. The Descent I love. I haven't seen. I think he did Doomsday as well. I haven't seen that. It was a hard film for me to read though, which I needed some help because it's so successful at being so entertaining and could slip right under your radar as a film that is just a lot of fun and a lot of action.
Well, and informative because we learn a lot about what you can do with super glue as well.
Yeah.
I feel like we're kind of winding this up here. And Chris, I was kind of with you on Dog Soldiers. It's always satisfying when we kind of come to the end to that film through the others because it all of a sudden seems like it, there's a lot of resonances there, and we see kind of a lot of facets that weren't immediately apparent that kind of rhyme with Company of Wolves and Curse of the Werewolf. And, I guess
I was going to say I also wonder if there's a significance to the fact that they're not like the A soldiers. They're not his elite team. They are the bait, essentially. They're expendable, and I think in a way you could see them as they're the weaker ones, but in a sense they are stronger because they are human. Like being human is what gives them value. Like as ridiculous as, I forget his name, his need to like know about the soccer game, like who's going to win the game, like that in the end is really important because it's his attachment to this human world. You know what I mean? And in the end, we also see that, a gift that was given to someone by another person, another human relationship, that's the thing that becomes a weapon in the end. I think it is a really something about this human. Things that could be seen as weaknesses by one person, by someone who needs killing machines is really what makes us strong. I think that's something that's interesting about the film.
But isn't his? It seems to me that Cooper's. It's Cooper, right? Yeah. That Cooper's. We're never meant to think that he's anything but elite. But it's his decency and his that act of mercy that sets him aside. And so yeah, I mean, I'm not disagreeing with you at all. I think that
no. I do think that. I guess from a certain perspective, it's definitely not the perspective you're supposed to be in as the audience member. But I guess another perspective contained, assumed within the film is that higher level military guy sees him as weak.
Yes. Because he sees the human qualities as weakness.
Yeah.
I don't think I am disagreeing with you. I think that that as far as he's concerned, that those he wants him to become that monster. He wants him to which is kind of a traditional military strategy, right? To remove those human elements so that you can do the terrible things that you need to do. And Cooper retains those. Is he a hybrid? I don't know.
He wants him to just kill dogs and not care about soccer. That's what a good soldier. That's what he wants from. That is inhuman. But anyway.
All right. Well, so I think, just to recap, I think that we would all pretty well recommend all of these films.
Yes.
Company of Wolves. Company of Wolves definitely was the standout for me out of this batch. I watched it a long time ago and did not remember it being half as powerful as it was. I probably wasn't smart enough, but
I would say I loved it and I recommend it totally. I feel like there's barely a moment in that film that I don't think is like really interesting or like beautiful in some way, and it's not long; it flies by.
Yeah, and I forgot to mention when I was summarizing it, but it's based, I think Angela Carter, the writer, she wrote the script is based on a story.
Yeah, it's based
she's
on
amazing.
Her.
Yeah, so this has been really fun talk, guys. I feel like I think we got somewhere by the end.
I think so. I guess I was thinking that, again, like with body horror, we kind of, maybe talked about this a little bit, and that with this as well, it came at a certain point too. A lot of it is talking about what it means to be human.
Yeah.
And I think that's an interesting place that we keep coming back to, is no matter how many monsters or whatever transformations we're talking about, the thing that always is victorious is humanity, but it keeps coming back to being human and what that means. And I don't know, when we think of the subject for the next podcast, maybe that should be something we consider.
I like it. All right. Well, thanks a lot, guys. Don't stray from the road. Stay off the moors. Thank you.
All right. Thanks.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye.